Welcome to the Stay Cozy Flamingo Snuggler tutorial. I'm Jessica with Stay Cozy Creative Co., and I'm so excited that you've joined me today to learn how to make this adorable flamingo. We'll be using hand crochet techniques, which means no hook necessary, and the chenille yarn. I'm using one skein of this flamingo pink color, which can be found on my website at staycozyco.com. But also feel free to use any scrap yarn you have lying around. We're going to get started with a magic circle by wrapping the yarn around our fingers, tucking a loop through the back, and making a slip knot to secure it in place. You want to make your loop big enough to fit about 2 fingers through it, so you want to pull that loop snug, and then you're going to reach in to that first loop, and we're going to do 4 single crochets into the center of this circle. So I reached into the center, pulled a new loop through, so now I have 2 loops on my fingers, and then I'm going to pull a new loop through both of those, and that's 1 single crochet. Now I'm going to do a second one the same exact way. If you're new to hand crochet or just crochet in general, feel free to stop this video at any time, rewind, and watch it again. That's the beauty of videos, is that you can watch it as many times as you want. So for this third single crochet, I reached into the center of that circle, pulled a new loop through, and then a new loop through both of those. And then I'm going to pull on the tail of my yarn to kind of tighten up that circle so that I don't have a big hole in the middle. And I'm going to do my final single crochet. Once you have 4 single crochets around that circle, you're going to gently pull on the tail of that yarn to cinch up the center of the circle so that you don't have a hole. And we're going to count our stitches. So don't count this loop. 1, 2, 3, 4 complete stitches. And so to start our second row, we're going to take our loop, put our fingers back into it, and then we're going to reach around into that first loop that we had made. And we're going to pull a new loop through there, and we're basically doing a single crochet here. So there's 1, and we're going to double them this time so that we have 8 total. So we're going to reach into that same loop again to make another single crochet. So we just made 2 single crochets into the same hole, and now we're going to go into the next loop and do the same thing. So we're going to go into the center, pull a new loop through so that you have 2 on your fingers, and then pull a new loop through those 2. So that was our third single crochet. Now we're going to do our fourth. And then now we're going to move on to the next loop. So basically to double it, we're just doing 2 single crochets into each of our first 4 loops that we had made in that first row. So this will be my 5th single crochet, and then my 6th one into that same loop. And then our last 2 single crochets for this row will go into the final loop here. So you can see that I'm starting to form kind of like a cone shape, and that is totally fine. This is forming the base or the bottom part of our flamingo. And so we are going to kind of work our way up. So it's okay that it's coning. We do not want it to be flat. Now we are going to make 3 more rows of 8 single crochets. So you should have 8 loops all the way around. So I'm counting here just to make sure. And if you have 8, then you're just going to do a single crochet into each one of those loops for your next row. And we're going to do that for 3 rows. If you want to use a stitch marker or a piece of string to keep track of where you are, you're welcome to do that. I almost never do and end up having to recount several times, so it would probably be smart to use one, but if not, you just will need to make sure that you're keeping track of your stitches as you go. It's important to pay attention to the size of your loops as you're creating. As you can see, my fingers easily fit into each of these loops. You don't want them to be too tight where you're having to pull really hard on your yarn, but you also don't want them to be super loose. Otherwise, your final flamingo will be a little floppier than intended. And then as I reach into this loop and pull my yarn through, I want to make sure that there's not a lot of extra yarn on the inside of my flamingo. So I always just want to keep it kind of snug. So if you're new to hand crochet or to any kind of hand making, this might take a little bit of time to get used to and for your hands to get used to the sizing that you need. So just be patient with yourself and take your time. I've now reached the end of my final row of 8 single crochets. So if you remember, we had our first magic circle with 4 single crochets, and then we did 4 rows of 8 single crochets. And now we're going to go back down to 4. So I'm skipping that first loop and going into the second loop to make my next single crochet. And I'm going to skip the one next to that and go into the 4th one. So basically I'm doing every other loop so that I can cut my stitches in half for this next row. That was my 4th single crochet. So for this next row, we're going to decrease down to 2. So again, I'm going to skip that first loop and go into the second loop and make my single crochet into there. And then I'm going to skip the next one and go into that 4th loop. So this is kind of tight. You really have to pull your yarn around to the other side. Make sure to keep the tail of your yarn on the inside of your flamingo. Don't let it come to the outside. So now we have 2, and we're going to increase back to 4. So this can be a little bit tricky to make sure that you're finding the right loops, but you want to keep your tail of your yarn in the center of your flamingo neck is what we're doing right now, and really wrap that yarn around the outside back around to that other loop. So I'm going to pull that loop all the way around and make a new single crochet stitch into there, and I'm going to do that twice so that I do 2 single crochet stitches into this loop, and then I'll do 2 single crochet stitches into that second loop. This part of the flamingo definitely feels awkward, but you just have to trust the process. And I promise after this row, it gets a little bit easier again because the loops aren't so tight. So I'm going to count my stitches to make sure I have 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And now we're going to go on to our next row. So again, make sure your working yarn is always in the center of your flamingo, not on the outside. And we're going to increase to 6. So for this first one, we're going to do 1 single crochet into that first stitch, and then we're going to do 2 single crochets into this second stitch. Then back to 1 single crochet into this third stitch, and then 2 single crochets into that final 4th stitch. So since we're going from 4 to 6, that's why we're doing kind of the alternating amounts. So here I'll show you our 6 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then for this next row, we're going to do 6 again. So that just means 1 single crochet stitch into each of those loops. Now done with this row, and again confirming I have 6 stitches. Now for the final row, we're going to decrease to 3. So we're going to skip that first loop, go into the second one to make our first single crochet stitch. Then we'll skip the next loop and go into the 4th stitch. And then we'll skip the next loop and go into that final 6th stitch to make our 3rd single crochet stitch of this row. And here we have our final flamingo body. So on top we have the head, and then the neck in the middle, and the body on the bottom. So you can grab your scissors to trim your yarn, and we're going to pull the tail of our yarn all the way through that final loop that we made, and then we're just going to gently cinch the top part of the head closed. And I'm just going to make a knot to kind of cinch up the top, and then I'm going to stuff the knot into the top part of the flamingo head. However, you are welcome to use a lighter if you have one on hand, and you can light the end of your yarn on fire and then kind of singe it to another part of the yarn. But if you don't have a lighter or aren't comfortable using one, you can just do the knot like I did, and then I'm trimming off some of the excess yarn. And then you can find the hole right at the top of the flamingo's head and just push that down into the center. And congratulations, we have come to the end of the flamingo head, neck, and body. I'm going to grab the white chenille yarn that I have here. You don't need a full skein, so if you have any scrap yarn around, you're welcome to use that. And we're going to be working on the beak next. So here I'm kind of just trying to find which loop I want to use for the beak, because you want it to be kind of right in the center of the head. So it's kind of up to you where you want to do the placement, but I'm just looking at finding which one looks mostly in the center. So I'm going to do this one here, and it is about 1-2 rows down and right in the center of the head. So I'm going to grab my white chenille yarn, and we're going to start by putting a loop underneath that loop on the front of the head. And we're going to make this into a slip stitch. So I'm just going to push a loop up from the bottom to the top, and then I'm going to grab my working yarn and push a loop up through that one. So this makes our slip stitch, and you can pull on the tail of that yarn to kind of tighten it up. And I like to make these loops a little bit smaller so that the beak doesn't get too floppy. And we're going to chain 2 more. So you should end up with 3 white loops total. And then after this, we're going to switch to our black yarn. So as you can see, I have even less black yarn because we really only need a little bit of it for some accents. And so I'm going to take that and slip it into that last loop of the white. We are going to do 1 slip stitch. So put a loop up and through, and then pull a new loop through that one. So that's our slip stitch, and you can pull on the tail again to tighten it up. And then we're going to chain 2 with the black yarn. So again, keep these loops just a little bit tighter. And here we're forming the front part of the beak. So we're actually going to switch back to our white color yarn and then wrap that back towards the head of the flamingo. So you can grab your scissors and trim your black yarn. And you just need a few inches because we're going to end up knotting this, but we're going to take our white yarn that should still be connected to the other side, and we're going to kind of fold that black yarn back on itself and pull a new white loop through. And so we're going to chain 3. So there's 1, there's 2, and then there's our 3rd loop in that chain. You can grab your scissors again, and we're going to trim our white yarn now. So again, you just need, I think I have like 6 inches of yarn, which should be plenty. But before we connect that, we're actually going to knot this black yarn together. And so you want this knot to kind of end up on the inside of the beak. So I'm going to pull it pretty snug so that it makes the front part of that beak tight together. And I'm going to knot it and then trim the ends so that there's none sticking out. Again, if you have a lighter and want to use that for this step, you're welcome to do so. Now we're going to go back to the white part of the beak, and we're going to take that beginning tail and put it through that last loop that we made. And then we're going to take the end tail and we're going to loop that through the first loop of our beak. And then we're going to gently pull those together so that it kind of cinches that beak together. And then here I'm taking that tail and tucking it underneath the pink strand on the front of the flamingo's head. And that's just to secure it with a second strand. And then before we knot it off and finish it, just kind of stand your flamingo up. Make sure you like the way that the beak looks, that you like the placement of it, and that the sizing and everything looks good. And then I'm going to knot these two together. I'm going to pull them pretty snug because I want that knot to be hidden. And then I'm going to trim the tails of those, and then I'm going to push that knot into the head of the flamingo. So here you could also use a lighter if you had one. If you use a knot, then you can just press that in like I'm doing here, and then just make sure that that beak is secure and in place. And congratulations, your flamingo now has a beak. And our next step are the wings. The wings are going to be on both sides of the flamingo body, and so we want to do our best to find two loops that are right across from each other at a similar height where we can connect the wings. So I found mine, and I'm going to roll my flamingo onto its side and get started. So we're going to do a slip knot to get our yarn connected to the flamingo body, and then we're going to chain 6 with this pink yarn. So this is our slip knot, and you can pull on the tail of that yarn to tighten it up and make sure it's secure to the side. And then we're just going to pull a loop through this loop to make the first of our chain. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if you decide that you want your flamingo to have shorter or longer wings, you're welcome to do that, but I like this length and I think it looks good with the size of the body. So we're going to leave our pink yarn connected, but we're going to grab our white yarn and we're going to use a slip stitch to connect it to that last loop of the pink. So I just put a loop of the white up and through, and then a loop through that one to make our slip stitch. And now we're going to do like a half single crochet stitch or like a binding off stitch up the front side of the flamingo wing. So you're going to lay that white loop down on top of the pink one next to it, and then pull a new white loop up and through. And then you're going to take that new white loop, lay it down on top of the pink loop next to it, and pull a new white loop up and through. You're going to do this 6 times until you're to the top of the wing. And you want to make sure that with each of these stitches that you're only going through the front side of that pink loop. So you don't want to really be covering up the whole wing, but just that front half of it so that there's a little bit of pink still sticking out on the back side. When you get to the top of the wing, it can be a little tricky figuring out what part is the next loop. So just do your best to kind of separate those out and find the loop that's on the front side of that pink to go through. And then with my 6th one, I actually had even a more difficult time finding it. So just do the best you can. And honestly, at the end of the day, it is really how it looks to you. So if it feels good with only doing 5 of these white loops up the front of the wing, that's totally fine. But if you can fit that 6th one in, do that so it goes to the top of the wing. Here, I'll show you my 6 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then this is my last loop. So I'm going to grab my scissors, trim that white yarn, and then pull that tail all the way up and through. And then you can also trim your pink yarn. Now we're going to connect our yarn ends and also make sure that everything is secure and in place. So I'm going to take this white yarn and tuck it into the top of that wing, kind of like where we connected the pink loop originally, and back around, and then I'm going to tie it together with the beginning pink yarn. So this would be a good place to use a lighter if you didn't want to have the bulk of a knot there, but I'm just doing a knot, pulling that tight, trimming the ends short, and then kind of just tucking it into the armpit of that wing so that you don't see it. And now we're going to knot the other end of the wing. So I'm going to take the pink and white yarns again, and I'm going to knot those together just at the end. And again, I'm pulling that pretty snug and tight so that it's not sticking out, and then grabbing my scissors to trim off any excess yarn. we have it. We're done with one of the wings, and you should be able to flip it kind of up and down like a wing would work, and it's time to move on to the other side. I recommend laying your flamingo down on its back and just making sure that you're comfortable with where you're placing your next wing. So I'm going 2 loops over till the other side, and we're going to start again with a slip stitch to connect it to the body, and then chain 6. Then it's time to switch to our white yarn. So I'm going to grab this scrap piece because it should be plenty long, and I'm going to do a slip stitch onto that last loop of the pink to connect it. And then remember, we're going to work up the front part of that wing. Once you have your slip stitch, then we're going to do our stitches up the front of the wing by laying that white yarn down on top of the pink loop and pulling a new white loop up and through both of those. Well, I guess I was cutting it very close with this scrap piece of yarn, but I did make it all the way to the top of the wing, and I have my 6 stitches just like I did on the other side. And now it's time to connect and secure our tails. So I'm going to take that white yarn and kind of tuck it through the pink loop at the top so that it goes to the other side, the underside of the wing, and then I will be able to knot it to the pink strand of yarn. And on this side, I actually decided to leave the tails of the yarn out and just tuck them into the flamingo itself so that it would hold that wing in place a little bit more. So if you find that your knot is sticking out on the other side, you're welcome to do this on this other side just to kind of hold it in place a little bit better. And now it's time to finish off the other end of the wing. So I'm just going to trim my yarn to make it easier to knot, and I'm going to knot the white and pink together and then cut off the excess yarn at the end. Congratulations, you have finished the wings of your flamingo. So we have a good chunk of this snuggler done, and our next step is to add the tail. So we're going to flip it over to the back side, and we're going to find the center loop at the bottom part of the body, and this is where we're going to attach the tail. Grab more of your pink yarn, and we're going to attach it to this back loop with a slip stitch. So push a loop up from the bottom to the top, and then put a loop up through that one and pull on the tail of the yarn to tighten it and cinch it in place. Then grab your white yarn, and we're going to attach this to that loop with another slip stitch. So we're going to put it into the center of that loop and then pull our yarn around to push a loop up and through that one. So there's our slip stitch. And then we're going to do 2 half single crochets. So the first one, you're going to reach into the center of that pink loop and pull a new loop up and through the pink and the white one. And then for the second one, you're going to go on the outside of that pink loop and pull a white loop up and through that white one. So you kind of alternate, go in and then go out so that it wraps around that pink part of the tail. Then we're going to trim our yarn and pull the tail up and through that last loop. And then take that white part of the tail and push it down to the underside of the tail, and here we're going to knot it with the beginning white part of that yarn. So we're just going to pull that knot pretty tight and secure, and then trim off the excess yarn. And again, you could use a lighter here if you wanted to. And then we're going to do the same thing with the 2 strands of pink yarn. So I'm going to trim this down just to make it easier. And I'm going to knot these 2 together and pull it pretty snug up to the base of that tail. And then I'm going to push that into the inside of the flamingo. So you can keep the tails of that yarn out as long as they aren't super long, and just tuck it into the back side to hide them. And there you have your cute little tail. So I love this because it's very simple, but it adds a nice white pop to the back side of that flamingo and a little extra detail. And we have come to one of our final steps, and that's to add the legs to this flamingo. So I'm going to use some of this cashmere color yarn. You could use any color that you like, but I have this available on my website, and I like that it is a different color than any other part of the flamingo, so it'll stand out, but it's not too dark. And I measured about 2 arm spans length of yarn to do these legs, which is probably way too much, but I just wanted to make sure that I could make them as long as I wanted them because they're kind of cute and floppy and add to the overall image of the flamingo. So we're going to look at the bottom side of the body now and find 2 openings on either side of the bottom part. So I kind of counted over 2 from the center just so that they would be equal on both sides, and we're going to weave our yarn up into the flamingo and then out the other side. Once you're able to get that yarn all the way through, you want to pull that side down until you have an equal amount of yarn on both sides for both legs. And then now I'm going to determine how long I actually want these legs to be. You could do short ones, you could do overly long ones to make it kind of goofy looking, but I'm going to set my flamingo up and kind of just see what looks natural for me. So I'm thinking about the same length as the body would look nice and would have kind of like a nice balance to it. So I'm going to make a knot right here and do a slip knot. So that's where I'm going to make the foot on this side of the flamingo. And then once you have this slip knot made, you can double check that you like the length and then go to the other leg and make a slip knot on that side as well. Once you have the feet positioned where you want them to be, then we're going to go to one side of the slip knots and chain 4. You can make these loops a little bit on the smaller end, just big enough to fit 2 fingers through to make the loops. Then we're going to pull that bottom loop around to the top part of the foot and then grab the tail of your yarn, and we're going to slip that into the back side of that loop and out the other side of the first loop. And then we're going to go to the other foot and do the same thing. So grab that slip knot and chain 4. And once you're done with your chain, you're going to pull that bottom loop up to meet the first loop, and then take the tail of your yarn and slip that through that last loop and through the first loop to connect those. At this point, I recommend double checking the length of the legs and the feet again, just to make sure that you're happy with them before we finish them off. And if you are, then now we're going to knot the end of our yarn around that top part of the foot. So I'm just going to wrap that yarn around the leg and then pull a knot tight and snug right at the top part of the foot. And then I'm going to do that again to make sure that it is secure. And as I've been saying all video, if you'd like to use a lighter instead of doing knots, you are more than welcome to do that. And now we're going to finish off the other side in the same way. Now that these are done, I'm going to grab my scissors to trim off the excess yarn. And now the only thing that's missing are the eyes. But before we move on, if for some reason, even after all of the measuring and double checking, if you think that your legs are too long, you can always cut your yarn and knot it, or you could just make a knot and simply shove that into the flamingo to make them a little bit shorter. But I actually like these long legs and think that they fit the style perfectly. So we're going to move on to our final step, and that's adding the eyes. I'm going to use some black chenille yarn for my eyes, but you're more than welcome to use any kind of eye that you like to use on your snugglers and stuffies. If you're using chenille yarn like me, then you're going to need 2 strands that are about 8 inches long each. And we're going to find the side of the head to where we want to attach these eyes. And the biggest thing is that you want them to be pretty equal on both sides so it doesn't look lopsided. So you might have to look a little bit to find a loop that looks similar on both sides of the head. But once you find the ones that you want to use, you're simply going to loop one of your strands of chenille yarn underneath that loop on the head, and you're going to make a knot. So if you want your flamingo to look like it has some eyelashes, you can leave some of the length to that yarn out. You can also trim it if you want them to be a little bit shorter, or you can simply turn that knot around and tuck the tails of the yarn into the head of the flamingo so that there are no eyelashes. As always, double check that you like the placement of these eyes before finishing them off, and I do, but these lashes are just a little too long for my liking, so I'm going to trim them up a little bit. And there you have it. We have our finished Flamingo Snuggler. I hope you love this as much as I do, and even if you had a change of heart like I did right now at the last second to turn those eyes around and get rid of those lashes, feel free to do that. I'll show you here what it looks like so you can decide which style you prefer. But however you decide to finish off those eyes, I hope that you've enjoyed this project and this pattern. And if you're looking for more tutorials on hand crochet and hand knitting, you can find those on my website at staycozyco.com, as well as on my YouTube channel. You can find chunky yarns like this chenille yarn as well as tube yarn also on my website, and you can follow me on my social channels at Stay Cozy Creative Co. Again, I'm Jessica, and thank you so much for watching this tutorial today. Until next time, stay cozy, creative, and kind.